These are the type of actuators that this video deals with. These are worm drive actuators, 12 volt. Here we take note that direction is determined by the polarity so whatever polarity you have, positive to negative, negative to positive, will determine its direction. Here you want to slide the outer sleeve out carefully, because if you pull on it too hard, then you'll damage the wiring inside. Don't lose that. Notice that there's a difference in the magnet position, so you want to make sure when you reassemble that the larger open space goes down. Notice the worm gear. Springs to the brushes. Don't lose them. You have 4 small screws to take out, which will give you some freedom to the wiring. When you're putting these screws back in, be really careful not to over tighten. They will easily strip out. And there you can see you can kind of pull some slack. And what you're really wanting to do is give some slack so that you can pull that switch assembly out of the housing. And of course the idea is not to damage the wiring. So desoldering, taking the wires loose, and then eventually getting the switches and the little diodes that are on the switches broken loose so that we can test them. Now every one of these that I have found that have gone bad, it is the diode that goes bad. And the diode is only a 1 amp diode. When you're increasing voltages up to like 24 or like I did one time, 40 volts, then you're bound to blow something. And this is what usually goes bad. Now you notice the meter, I'm getting a reading in one direction. I should not get a reading in the other. But I do, so that is a bad diode. Now notice this test of a brand new diode. This is a 2 amp diode, brand new. There's no reading in that direction. Flip it around, change the polarity, and I do have a reading. So that is a good diode. For those that are unaware, diodes are switches that, when turned on or off, will determine whether current can flow or whether current is blocked. That's why current only flows in one direction with them. So we're disassembling. We took apart the front switch, which is the extended switch. Now we're doing the retract switch so that when it comes in, retracts in, it doesn't go too far. These actuators are strong enough to where if these switches are not working, this thing can literally destroy itself if you don't catch it in time. So these switches are very important. So we'll check this diode on this one. The front one was bad, the extend switch was bad. No reading that direction. Flip it around, change the polarity. We do have, that's a good good diode. And neither one of these switches that were on there were bad, but we're going to replace them anyway for a very special reason. But you notice here that the original diode, the 1 amp diode, is being replaced by a larger 2 amp diode. Now because it is larger, it doesn't fit in the same space. Now notice these switches here. The switches that come with it have a very small area to control the movement. And you notice here on the new switches, I'm going to cut out and remove that center terminal. Don't need it. And you notice that on these new switches there's a long lever at the bottom. This gives more time to make contact and to be able to turn off the switch, whereas the old ones had just a very limited amount of contact time. So if you're paying attention here to the positioning of the switches, notice those little levers and the positioning. Then you put the diodes down, and you'll note that on diodes of this nature there's a little stripe on them. You can see it here in the video. Just look real careful. It's at one end or the other of the diode, depending on how you're holding it. You want that one with the stripe to go towards the front, and then on the other side you want the stripe to go towards the motor. So both the switches and the diodes are positioned in a very particular way. And here's a diagram coming up here to help you see a little better what I'm talking about. So you see the switches And the little levers, how they're positioned, and then the diodes as well are positioned a very particular way. And you take note that you cut that center piece out of the switch. Now I'll put a link in my initial comments to where you can get these switches and where you can get the diodes. So hopefully that'll be helpful to anyone that wants to upgrade these. You should be able to handle 24 volts with no problem with this. And of course, keep in mind that a 12 volt DC motor running at 24 volts, you're going to shorten the life of it. So in my mind, the benefit outweighs the loss of life, because these are very inexpensive actuators to replace. So here you have a diagram, again illustrating the positioning of the switches and the positioning of the diodes. Note the stripe position on the diode that sits on the top of the switch, and note the position of the switch itself. More than likely, the wires that come out of the motor they start off as red and turn to yellow and return back into the motor in yellow. Now here I've gotten rid of the plastic piece because with the larger diode, the space that they allow in this thing is absolutely just get by, and when you change it up, it makes it really difficult to reassemble. I've been able to get them reassembled, but it's hard. So what I have found, it's better to take that long plastic piece out and put heat shrink wrap on the wires to stiffen it up a little bit. Now here I'm testing to see if it'll slide all the way through this tube, and it won't. It's not quite. It's kind of tight and it binds. So I'm going to take a screwdriver and a pair of vice grips and twist it in such a way as to open wider this upper chamber on this tube. It's a little better. Now that's actually the way that needs to go, with the two holes on the tube towards the motor. And notice that I had sealed the switches with some electrical tape, and the tape is blocking the holes, the mounting holes. So I'm taking a little drill, hand drill, and going through and opening up that hole. So when it's on the inside, that switch will be positioned where the hole will come to that hole in the housing, and then I'll put the screw in. It'll lock it down. Now this is very important that you turn this in such a way as to align those three risers in such a way as they fit like that, as illustrated there. Now I'm going to use one of the long bolts that secured the motor because it's long and it's stiff and it's small enough to slide into that tube. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing on the back side of that switch and pushing it down the tube. Just about as far as I can go with that. And we'll take it out. Now I'm going to position the rear switch and push on it gently, and hopefully that forward switch will come to the right spot, and it does. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but that hole that I had drilled out earlier is right there, and that's where my screw is going to go to lock it down. Get the front switch secured. And then I can work on the back switch. And sure enough, that hole is in the perfect spot. That hole in the front switch and the extension switch is not there. You have to drill that hole in that aluminum. Okay? So you've got to kind of estimate where it should go. And if you're not good at that sort of thing, then you need to get someone to help you. The same with soldering and things like that. If you're not good at it, get someone to help you. Be careful to take your slack up out of the wiring in that housing, because when you slide that tube in, you can crush that wiring in there if it's loose. Now what I'm doing here is, remember I had opened these up, I had expanded these some, and so I'm putting some pressure on them to kind of close that up a little bit again. And so I've got it in there. It's not quite right. I'm making sure my wires are not there, not in the way. It's getting close. I'm pretty comfortable with the wires not being there. I can see the edge of the hole, but I'm going to have to tap on it to make it come down far enough. So give it a couple of taps, and now it's in place enough where I can go ahead and put my screw back and lock all that into place. So you want to tuck your wires in. You don't want the big long bolts coming down and skinning these wires and having a short inside the motor. So you got to kind of tuck them out of the way. Reposition this brush assembly. And then start putting in the small screws. And these are the screws to be careful with. Just put them in to where they're snug. Don't over tighten them. They will strip. Now I'll get my springs back into place for the brushes. Put the brushes into the slide and then take and pull them back, and there's a little notch on these things that'll hold the brush back so that you can put the armature back into place. And once that's in place, you kind of pop those off that little notch and let the springs push the brushes out towards the motor. Now you put your finger on that, because that'll lift that back out. Those magnets are pretty powerful. So you kind of put your finger on it and push down. Get that into the approximate place. Put your little thrust spring bearing washer thingy there. And get the screws back into it. These screws you can tighten up pretty good, but still you don't need to over tighten. Just make sure they're good and snug. Okay, I'm ready for a test to see if I got movement. Yes, I do. It'll retract. Now change the polarity. It'll extend. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and check my extension switch. It should shut it off, and it did. Now I'm going to go all the way down the other way, and it should shut it off at the point where it's running out of room. And it did. Good to go. Now this little collar or sleeve, whatever you want to call it, it basically does two things. It helps to keep dust out, and it helps to center that extending tube so that it doesn't wobble much. And remember, I opened this up, so I got to squeeze that back down just a little bit to get it right. Just a little more adjustment there to get that to pop into place. There we go. Now it's ready for the screws. And the final screw. Now in real time, some of this is fast forwarded here. In real time, it'd probably take you about an hour if you're somewhat mechanically inclined and electrically inclined. If you're not, get some help. Alright, a final test. Should be able to extend it out and have it stop on its own, and should be able to retract it and have it stop on its own. There, it did. Reversing polarity. Now, depending on what you're going to do with these actuators, I'm running 24 volts on a front end loader on a small tractor. That's why sometimes you might need to make a repair. If you do this, 24 volts should be safe. 40 volts you could have some regular problems with. 20 volts you won't have any problems with. So hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I hope that you'll subscribe to our channel and that you will click the like button. Thank you so much.